Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Chase. I'm a visiting senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund's Brussels office, focusing on international economics. GMF, or the German Marshall Fund of the United States, was established in 1972 as a gift, based on a gift from the German government to the American people to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Marshall Plan. And this is important because, in a way, the whole question of our job is to promote transatlantic cooperation based on the spirit of the Marshall Plan, which is very much this question of democratic values, economic development, and of course, European integration. In that sense, industrial policy is a part of the DNA of GMF, because the Marshall Plan was all about rebuilding the Western Europe after the terrible devastation of World War II. We're always very, very active in the rebuilding and the promotion of development in the Central European economies after the fall of the war, and of their integration into the European Union, the single market, and NATO. And so in that sense, what we're doing now is perfectly in line with the whole spirit of the German Marshall Plan. As you know, one of our major focuses right now is how we help Ukraine recover from the devastation that Mr. Putin has foisted upon it. I'm therefore deeply pleased to host today's seminar, in which Michael Klubi is going to present the fruits of his research during his Rethink CEE fellowship. GMF established the Rethink CEE fellowship in 2017 to generate fresh thinking and ideas for Central Europe. We wanted to tap into the enormous capabilities of the people in that region to think about how they build their own future. We have about a dozen people are on these fellowships each year, and it's a year-long non-resident thing where they do some research and they also get together. So it builds a network of people who are involved in the rebuilding, rethinking of government policy in the region. Michael is a perfect example of the talents that we bring. He is an economist. He got his master's from the Skoda Auto University. His background is actually, he's also a PhD candidate. Can't forget that he's a PhD candidate for the Prague University of Economic Affairs and a scientific assistant at Skoda Auto University. His focus is on economic transitions and industrial transformation, which in fact is the purpose of his paper. His paper is going to focus on building on his own experience on the new emphasis on industrial policy in European Union as a whole, and how Eastern Europe can actually benefit from this, learning from its experience from the past and the way in which its economies are integrated now into the European economy, the broader European economy. After Michael gives his synopsis of his paper, we have two very, very qualified people to provide some initial comments and thoughts and insights on it. Mats Engström from the European Council on Foreign Relations and Susanna Savarska from the Vienna Institute of International Economic Studies. Mats, who was a longtime policy advisor to the Swedish government on European policy issues, especially in the environmental areas, has a Master of Science in Engineering Physics, which I just had to cite because I think that's so interesting, and has been editor-in-chief of one of Sweden's leading technology papers. Susanna, for her part, focuses on economic development in the V4 countries, and she came to WIIE, the Vienna Institute of International Economic Studies, after 4 years advising the Slovak government on economic policy, both as a member of the National Productivity Board and as the head state advisor for the economic and social development at the government's Institute for Strategy and Analysis. So we have a lot of people in the audience who have specialty and also have insights. So after we have Michael present his paper and some comments from Mats and Susanna, I'd really like to turn it over to you. I'd really encourage you to write comments and questions and thoughts in the box, the chat box. I will read those out so that we can keep this as part of the recording, and then we'll go from there. But please do engage, do challenge, particularly challenge Michael, but also you can challenge Mats and Susanna as well. In any event, Michael, why don't you go ahead and start, and let's go from there.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this introduction, and once again to Susanna and Mats for accepting this invitation. I will be very happy if you also challenge them, not only me, but very happy to definitely go through the paper, but also beyond. Let me now share my screen, and please, once you see it, if you could just confirm me that you see it all. So, is it okay?
You're on perfectly.
Great, thank you. So I would like to introduce shortly my paper on rethinking industrial policy for Central and Eastern Europe. And in this case, we will, now actually, I just cannot move my slide, so maybe I will stop sharing and try it again. Sorry for this. So now it's better. Now it should be working, and you should see the second slide.
Yep.
Good. So I will shortly speak about 5 measure points of the policy paper, but I'm sure that the discussion will go beyond. We will touch upon the comeback of industrial policy. We will speak about the position of Central and Eastern Europe within the EU manufacturing and assess its outlook. We will specifically look on 2 case studies of Czechia and Hungary, especially in the battery and semiconductor industries. And I hope that some of the key takeaways of this paper can be actually generalized towards the CEE region, depending, of course, on some very specific aspects that we will discuss. So maybe at the very beginning, I would like to briefly mention that when I now speak about industrial policy, I probably accept quite a general description by OECD, which is based on a definition that it's a policy which encompasses all the instruments which try to let's say, structurally improve the domestic business sector. And in my paper, I really focus on the manufacturing sector and the countries of EU CEE member states. However, it's quite interesting to know that we now live through a time where industrial policy is really back in advanced economies, especially on the transatlantic axis, where before, during the Washington Consensus, it was not actually a very look-for type of policy. But now, best exemplified by Inflation Reduction Act in the US or Net Zero Industry Act in the EU, we see its comeback, especially in the last 5 years. What is changing from the perspective of the EU is that we don't have much of a new common financing with which we would like to support the indicative plans towards 2030 and beyond. And it seems that in some aspects, we try to more focus on the national spending and the role of national states in this industrial policies and the transition of manufacturing sector, which brings the question of whether, given the different rooms that countries have to actually spend money on the industrial policy, it does not lead to some more EU single market fragmentation. Looking at the Central and Eastern Europe, we can say that our region is really now an integral part of the EU manufacturing. And this is not only because of exports of final products, but it's especially because of exports of inputs, which are then used in also the production in the western part of the Europe. So many of the CEE region countries are highly industrialized. They are based on fabrication and export-oriented tasks, and they are usually under a large share of foreign control, especially when we speak about the volumes and value added of the production. In the past, it's been a very let's say strategic that the single market integration was built through EU funds, especially looking at different infrastructure projects, energy, transport, regional development, but also innovation. And we could also see in the past decades state aid used strategically for different promotion of foreign direct investments, maybe a bit more targeted case by case to support the local manufacturing. Now, if we look at the outlook, which we partly try to assess in the paper, there are some general points in the new industrial policy which should be discussed and which should be taken into account, especially thinking about what the industrial policy should achieve. In literature, usually export promotion is something which is more commonly used with better results compared to import substitution. But actually some of the new regulations, not only Net Zero Industry Act, but also the EU Chips Act, actually largely built on the import substitution. We should also take into consideration that a lot of changes that we see in the economy are based on some accumulated knowledge that we have from the past, from the historical development of industries. So there is definitely a path-dependent change within those industries. And then third, we definitely should focus on assessing costs and benefits which are brought by the new concepts of industrial policy, which actually brings me to the way that we usually see public spending with quite clear objectives these days, especially in achieving some indicative plans in the future years. But maybe sometimes there is a missing rationale for some of those industrial policies, largely, of course, resting on the very recent need to really build strategic capabilities and capacities in the EU, but still with some more maybe in-depth analysis needed in the future. So now the new EU industrial policies seem to be more focused really on building the production capacities across the EU. And we can say that this is a new form of EU industrial policy, which has been and is still based largely on competition policy, but now with probably more room also for industries for their negotiating position with the push in several selected strategic areas where we basically really want to increase the production here. The paper specifically looks at two case studies, which I briefly comment on here. So first, we zoom in on the Hungarian battery industry, and second, we look at Czech semiconductor industry. In the first case study, we could really speak about a battery manufacturing miracle, because within last couple of years, we really see that there is a new production hub in Hungary, but also in Poland. And this came actually after quite a few years with large foreign direct investments coming from Asia. And especially in the case of Hungary, it is quite interesting to see that there has been no strategic decision preceding. This has been mostly pushed by the foreign investors. But of course, Hungary has been able to capture this trend with very specific and tailor-made so-called VIP cash schemes. So a large spending, not only through state aid to support the foreign direct investments, but also with a lot of spending going towards development of all the infrastructure needed and many other areas, which I also touch upon briefly. However, what's the issue with this large scale up of production is also quite the questionable environmental sustainability of all these new projects, which came online very quickly. And then several aspects maybe concerning the future development of the industry, because we see that Hungary had to employ many ad hoc solutions to attract cheap labor. We see so-called Foxconnization of the production, where it really rests a lot on cheap and medium-skilled labor, which is not actually available much in Hungary anymore. And there are questions whether these investments will actually bring any innovation in the country, especially for local companies, for small and medium enterprises, and whether this really like a factory model of manufacturing can sustain the growth in the future. On the other hand, we have Czech semiconductor industry, where there is quite rich history in this area of semiconductors and the different adjacent industries. Interestingly, just yesterday, a good timing for today's presentation, the Czech government announced the third largest FDI in the history of Czechia, which actually should go in semiconductor production capacity building in the following years. But it's largely conditioned, again, on a very generous state aid support from the country. And when we look at the general semiconductor industry, it's really very high capital intensive. But there is also the promise of its large R&D, so research and development intensity, which should somehow also help the local domestic value chain, which is very specialized in many areas of the semiconductor industry, coming from a rich history in optoelectronics, micro and nano electronics. So there is already a well accumulated specific knowledge and the promise of maybe increased innovation in the future, given the new investments, not only in manufacturing capacities, but also research and development. So closing this quick introduction of the content of the paper and what you can read online already on the GMF webpage, there are several recommendations which can be applied across different countries, but of course with some assessment and the note that there is really no one-size-fits-all recommendation towards industrial policy. But in general, CE countries should really assess the costliness of state aid. And if we really now have this push towards new manufacturing projects, there should really be focus on how they integrate into the domestic market and how knowledge or innovation is actually transferred from different multinational enterprises to the domestic, small and medium ones. In many cases, the growth that we saw in the last 20 years will not be sustained with only new manufacturing projects, but it should be largely based, especially on research, development and innovation. So maybe something that we've not seen to such extent in the past. Moreover, there should be much more focus on really analyzing the costs and benefits, because we are in times where we see fiscal consolidation, the budgets of countries are actually very tight. And now with some new regulations, the industries are in quite a good position for advocating for large subsidies, which can actually start at this so-called race to the bottom, where different states try to bet larger subsidies to attract new investments. So hence the countries in our region should be able to also rationalize where actually the industrial policy should be active. And in case that we pick those industries which we consider strategic, there should be really a clear rationale and objective for its financing. Last but not least, in countries as Czechia and Hungary, which we inspected closely, but also in some other countries, we already see that the labor market is quite tight. And in that case, we really would need to see more strategic, not only labor, but also education policies to prevent different ad hoc solutions for different immigration policies, especially concerning the low-skilled job position. Let me just finish with a quick note from Enrico Letta in his very recent report on the EU single market, that we really should develop bold and innovative solutions that strike balance between, on the one hand, the need to quickly mobilize national targeted public support for industry, insofar as it addresses in a proportionate way market failures, and on the other hand, the need to prevent the fragmentation of the single market. This report from Enrico Letta will be actually expanded to some extent by report, which is about to be online very soon by Mario Draghi on the EU competitiveness, where we will probably see much more focus and much more stress given the scale and finance for local EU industry. So this will definitely be, again, something to discuss in the upcoming weeks and months. So that would be all from my side. Thank you very much, and I really look forward for the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation of your paper. I have a number of questions that I'd like to be posing to you. I particularly like your reference to the Foxconnization of Hungary in a way, because I think that it points to one of the key issues, which is what is the value added that's being created by this industrial policy. I'm also interested a little bit on the something that you talked about in your paper, but we haven't talked about here, which is the difference between the general EU funds that have been used to promote cohesion with Central Europe and how Central Europe benefits from some of these industrial policy programs that the EU has now adopted. But I think that Susanna is going to provide some additional thoughts and insights first, because this is something that she's been directly involved in, and of course has a lot of insights into your paper. Michal's mentioned at the end of his comments that Mr. Draghi's report is soon going to be online. His own paper, the one that he was just been presenting to you, is actually online now. It's in the text box, and for those of you who haven't read it, here's your opportunity to download it. Susanna, would you like to come on in?
Yes, of course. Well, firstly, I would like to congratulate also Michal on the very well done paper as well as the presentation. And as someone who has been involved in the work of industrial policy in Central Eastern Europe, I'm very happy to see that it is becoming a topic which is much more discussed. I mean, it until very recently really wasn't something which was quite mainstreamly talked about in the Eastern European context. I can perhaps echo some of what has been said by Michal, what I feel is quite important, but also maybe add some additional points for further discussion. So I think the first one is that Central Eastern European industrial policy is in quite a unique time in history because there are two reasons. So first one being these external conditions which are changing, as Michal alluded to, this comeback of industrial policy motivated by very much changing times. So we have the digital transition, the environmental transition, demographic conditions are changing and so on, which is awakening industrial policy in Western countries, which have traditionally been very reluctant to vocally admit their usage of industrial policy instruments. But then from the internal side also, the development path that these countries have been taking, basically based on labor cost advantages and much driven by foreign direct investments to the production stage of the value chain, is reaching its limits. And we see various indications of this, whether it's through the productivity channel, but also, of course, through the labor channel, simply with acute labor shortages in these areas. So, and this next growth stage that Central Eastern Europe needs to embark on is much more difficult to achieve with simply market-driven industrialization. So the need of that more active policies is very strong, also from the internal as well as the external side. Still, what we find in Central Eastern Europe is generally a rather passive and still market-driven approach to industrial policy. FDI promotion still very much dominates in rather wide sectors. And as far as I'm aware, no Central Eastern European economy has explicitly set an industrial strategy. There's various fragments of it, but not necessarily a holistic industrial strategy per se. So I think we're still very much at the beginning of the process. I also very much appreciate the emphasis you make, Michal, on sort of an evidence-based type of approach, because as you mentioned, the resources are indeed scarce. So we have to be strategic with the way we utilize these finances to really achieve structural change, which would be conducive for this next stage of development. I think also what's relatively interesting is in the paper you use this term integrated periphery, which somehow hints at the peripheral standing of Central Eastern Europe. But it comes at an interesting time because from a wider European perspective, the manufacturing capabilities are beginning to be seen as more and more crucial, right? So we see from this greater interest of the West to have actually production stages also now much more closer and within certain regions. So I think from a CEE perspective, this is a relatively unique advantage. But of course, what we should be perhaps aiming at is this functional diversification. So not rather than upgrading only into those parts of the value chain, but actually viewing it as a diversified image, which of course at the moment we don't have in Central Eastern Europe because the production stage is so dominant. So that's just something which I think, having thought about these functional aspects for a relatively long time now, I think first I was also inclined to only say, we should shed this production stage and upgrade, but I think rather having a much more balanced set of tasks across the economy also is useful from a labor market perspective. In terms of sort of an inevitable path dependency to development, which there is in Central Eastern Europe, because it's very difficult to shed the specializations, I think this is one of the points you also mentioned in your paper. I think perhaps one point which you could have maybe more strongly elaborated on is that the next stage of industrial policy, also in the Central Eastern European context, will inevitably need the building up of local suppliers to the multinational enterprises, meaning that how can we make the multinational enterprises which are present in these economies more embedded into the local economy through local supplier development? Because there are countries in economic history which have had a very similar position, such as Ireland or Singapore and so on, which also us at the Institute recently analyzed. And we see that those countries have successfully then managed to build up local suppliers, which became globally competitive, and then also were able to follow these multinational enterprises into their other markets. So I think this ought to be really a key pillar of industrial policy in Central Eastern Europe going forward. And I think related to that, in the case study of the sectors which you chose, what would be very interesting to analyze more deeply is how domestic firms are involved basically in these sectors, not just the foreign enterprises. And how, to what extent this is still driven by foreign capital, as it seems to be the case in Hungary, for example, in the battery case, but also, as you mentioned, that there is a next big investment coming to Czechia. It will be interesting to see how embedded they are actually to the local actors as well, and whether there are some instances actually of, for example, domestic suppliers upgrading within these value chains. And of course, it would also be quite interesting to analyze more deeply these conditions that led to the choice of the specific sectors by the government. I mean, in the Hungarian case, you mentioned that it seems to be somehow much more market-driven and FDI dominated. But I guess there was also some strategic selection of the support given to these VIP schemes and so on. And I think this is really the ultimate question of industrial policies, choosing which sector to support. So maybe also digging deeper into whether this was a successful choice, whether this is a rational choice or not, would be very, very interesting for maybe your future research. And finally, before I take up too much of my time, just a minor point that you mentioned export promotion as the sort of preferred type of intervention for Central Eastern Europe. But then, of course, batteries and semiconductors are those exact sectors which have a very strong import substitution objective set by the EU. So, I mean, I just think maybe from the perspective of modern day industrial policy, whether this distinction still is really relevant at all. So I would leave it there.
Susanna, thank you very, very much. The question building up local suppliers, one of the questions, Michael, when you kind of respond a little bit to Susanna's point is, do these particular sectors, which everyone sees as being so sexy, e-vehicles and semiconductors, do they actually have a supply chain that domestic industry in Hungary and Czechia can actually contribute to? Or are they almost by definition going to be not integrated really into the rest of the economy? Mats, you've been doing the question of European policy, European development policy for a long, long time, and you've seen a lot of this question of the integration of the Central European economies. And I'd be really interested in kind of a little bit of zooming out, with Susanna having been able to zoom in, your views on this. And then what we'll do is we'll go and we'll focus a little bit on the technical part, and then we'll focus on the broader part. I do want to encourage everyone who is here. Again, I think that we have a large number of people participating in this. I know a lot of you have a lot of experience. Please do ask questions or make comments. Comments are good too. You don't need to ask questions. Put them in the chat thing, and I will be reading them out. Let me know if you want or don't want me to mention your name, please. Okay, Mats, turn to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations to Michelle for this excellent paper. Just to say a little where I come from with my perspective is that I'm based in Stockholm in Sweden, and I have been working on European Union policies for a long time, and I'm working then now with the ECFR, which is a pan-European think tank, but I also have a background in industrial innovation policies in different aspects. So what I would start to say is that I'm not an expert on individual CE countries, and there are many in the audience who know more about that than me, and experts here who have already spoken. I am quite interested, and I think it's really important for the whole of Europe, because first, it's a really important part of Europe. Also, if you look at the assets as such, and the supply chain, and the workforce, and many other things, but also for the cohesion of the European Union. Since I work also quite a lot on green transitions, I think it's really, really important that the benefits that are there from an industrial point of view are not only concentrated to some member states with big pockets who now also get most of the money from the EU Innovation Fund. So I think that is also a crucial issue, and it's also important from a global perspective around the European strategic autonomy. I think that there's a development in different parts of the Union. So before the discussion, I'll just try to mention 5 things. And first, I think it's important in this European perspective. It's not new to you who are researchers, but still, since I've also been in policy making, one always has to repeat the need to look ahead. And I think Michelle does that excellently in the paper and makes that point in these very good takeaways. There is always a tendency to try to protect what is there, and almost all that is there. And that's quite evident. I now think in the amount of state aid going out to European industry. So how to facilitate structural change, I think, is as a part of European policy is a key topic where I think now there is a balance too much towards saving everything, and to be a bit direct. Not all steel plants will still be there in 10 years. It's good to subsidize transitions of steel plants, but not everyone but they will have their jobs in 10 years, and you have to have policies to handle that. The second, and that's perhaps one of our main points, is the research and innovation part that Michelle also mentions. And here I go more directly to the CE countries, because as many of you know, and it's not only the CE countries, but many of them have low rankings on the EU innovation scoreboard. And I think this is a crucial issue to handle. And here there's much talk now about different kind of deals in Europe, the Green Deal, competitiveness deal, other deals. I think one should think a little, perhaps discuss what would a research and innovation deal mean that is both on the European level and on the nation state level. Because on the EU level, there will be negotiations now on the new long-term budget, and there will be negotiations on different policy areas, such as research policies, the Horizon Europe continuation, for example, the cohesion policy. But in member states also, there's a question about national budgets for research and development, which is not easy given the general conditions for finance that Michelle also alluded to. But I think there will be a development on the EU level for more conditionalities towards member states that receive cohesion funding in the next budget, like has been the case in this Recovery and Resilience Fund. And is it possible to find a good way to combine that so that there will be more pressure on governments to increase R&D investments, but also education improvements, and on our D&I is not only the money, it's quite a lot also about modernizing the national structures, bringing universities closer to industry, the ecosystem around institutes, a lot of things that I think are quite important to achieve this value added domestically that Michal is also describing in these case studies. So if there are conditionalities, what are reasonable demands from the EU level towards member states, and what are the instruments on the EU level that are necessary? We have some ideas about that in our work. I won't talk too long, there's always the risk to do that, but on skills, I just briefly also mentioned the gender dimension. I think that's important in all member states, that you increase the number of women in manufacturing and engineering. I think on access to capital, we are looking quite a lot on the EIB and what can be done to strengthen the role of the European Investment Bank. On skills, and that refers directly, I think, to the Hungarian case at least. We in our work are rather interested in these conditionalities that the US has in the IRA, for example, handing out subsidies. And you could imagine, both on the EU level and in a coordinated member state approach, that countries receiving now these state aids also are more committed to skills development among workers and also local in different ways. But that, I think, has to be coordinated, otherwise investors will just play out member states towards each other. And finally, just on digitalization, which I think is a general horizontal issue, and how can you bring the knowledge and the high level of education, IT startups in many parts of Central and Eastern Europe more directly into the manufacturing sector? How can that be facilitated? I know there are some projects. I was in Romania, for example, in Cluj, and there are others, I think. But digitalization, I also think, is a key issue. There was also general comments. I think it's an excellent paper. I could have commented more directly on the paper, but I stopped there. Thank you.
Mats, thank you very much. I think it's really important to pull out a little bit when we're focusing on something that is a technical issue. And your point about the need to look forward, look ahead. One of the questions that I have that I think we should defer a little bit, Michael, on is really whether or not a lot of these investments are good investments if they're protecting something, as opposed, or if it's import substitution rather than trying to help people transform to the next stage of development. Michael, you've had a couple of really good questions here, and I think, one of the questions I almost heard Susanna ask was, are these actually good investments? And do they do what you think that they should do in terms of the industrial policy that in this case, the Czechia and Hungarian governments, they spent some time trying to attract these investments. Was that smart? Should they have done something actually different? But just to build on some of the things that Susanna asked first, and then to step out. There's also, I think, this question about, I wanted to ask, Susanna mentioned that you had talked about the export promotion focus of this. I mean, the Central European countries, our economies are pretty small. Domestic demand is not going to drive it. So by definition, they're going to be export-oriented, but they're export-oriented first to the broader European economy, the single market, and integration into the single market is what this is about. Is that wrong? And is it wrong, or is it a problem that there's a lot of this is built on foreign investment, a lot of which that came in after, with the integration of the Central European countries 20 years ago to the single market? It should have been a good thing that there was that foreign direct investment coming in, and that these economies were building and were focusing on building for the broader economy here in quote, developed, the Western part of Europe. Are people doing the wrong thing? Are they repeating something? Do they really need to actually change?
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for this question. And I think it ties together many of the points which both Susanna and Mats commented on. Maybe I would start with the question about integration for indirect investments, whether it's good or bad. I mean, definitely from many perspectives, it's always good to have these foreign direct investments incoming. I think some elaboration maybe more in the future will tell us how good or bad this is, but it has to always be relative to some other scenario which we don't now observe. I would say that the truth is that our countries, even from the historical perspective, from the path dependence perspective, cannot very quickly change the structure of their economies. And from some perspective, they will remain very strongly oriented on fabrication tasks, which within the EU is really good in the sense of export promotion, because as you rightly mentioned, a lot of these products now, when we stick really to batteries and semiconductors, these are really products that will be largely exported to the EU market. And it's good from this perspective, but still maybe from the global perspective, the EU itself still tries to really promote this import substitution from other regions across the world. And maybe there is this question, especially concerning semiconductors, which are actually a very volatile business, which goes through quite some cycles throughout the past. The question is whether we don't actually aim to achieve some overcapacity across some of these manufacturing areas, and whether then actually those investments will really pay off in maybe the volume that we imagine now. That remains to be answered. But true is that for such small countries, it's usually very beneficial to export those products across the EU itself. So from this perspective, it's a good option. What was another point directed actually towards this topic is how then the domestic companies are integrated in those value chains. When we see all these big investments coming in our countries, at least in the case studies that I presented, semiconductors in Czechia are really about a handful of companies. We see one big US company, which is really like a manufacturing base of chips in Czechia. And on the other hand, we see a lot of companies with very long tradition in different specialized areas, which are connected to semiconductor industries. So there is actually a very strong history, even in the domestic companies, in domestic research and development and universities. So there is really a very good environment from where we have quite some accumulated knowledge, skills, and then these investments really make sense in the perspective that we are really able to integrate all these maybe small and medium enterprises into the value chain, and to actually aim for really this technological frontier, this best available technologies on the market, and maybe even push the frontier. On the other hand, in the case study of Hungary, we see that a lot of these investments, at least within the 5 years, brought really a large scale up in the production of battery cells. But so far, there is not much change in any local R&D and in some maybe upgrading of the position of the local domestic small and medium enterprises. So at the moment, at least in the data, we don't see such upgrading, but it can change throughout the time. Question is whether now, in case of other countries which try to attract battery producers, whether this can be somehow different, because truly now the knowledge and especially concerning the frontier technology is usually in hands of Asian companies, and how this knowledge can be transferred and how quickly we can build really like a domestic supply chains in battery production, that remains an open question for maybe next 10-15 years. So that is probably not something as easy to achieve as we foresee. Now I would stop, and maybe if I have time, I could still answer 2 questions, which we heard from Max and then Susanna.
Go ahead.
And that was also a question which you raised. So firstly, regarding the EU funds and national spending in the CE region, and how we actually benefited in the past from it. There is actually a good research done by Susanna and her colleagues in the Vienna Institute, which shows that In general, industry benefited much more from the EU funds. And this is largely connected to building infrastructure, to building energy infrastructure and transport infrastructure. So really integrating through increased and better business environment. And usually in the CE region, of course, we were largely benefiting from these funds, whereas the Western Europe was not, because these were usually coming from cohesion policy funds and other tools. Whereas in the post-COVID reconstruction period, we highly benefit also from the so-called RRF, this Recovery and Resilience Facility, again, helping our region to much larger extent compared to Western Europe. State aid was still largely used in our countries, but probably state aid has been somewhat more targeted towards specific businesses or specific industries. And this was especially the case of Hungary, which is probably applying more case-by-case type of state aid award granting compared to other countries. But we also observe it in the last years in Czechia, where state aid awards are becoming much more tailor-made and maybe less and less based on some transparent setting and transparent framework. So it is becoming much more targeted. What is probably a question towards future is that once there is no RRF and we want to build our industries and basically have this industrial transformation towards 2030, at the moment, there is not much fresh EU-wide money. There is no EU sovereignty fund, which has been discussed in the previous 2 years. So far, we don't see anything like that. And there are new tools which mostly reshuffle the already existing EU funds. So there will be more focus on state aid, which then links back to the fiscal capacities of the countries. And also for the EU CE member states, it's important that in time, of course, we want to, and it would be actually good if we are not forever net benefits from the EU funds, but we will actually become net contributors to EU funds. So in general, the EU funds should be much more tight for us in the future, and the national spending will become probably more and more important. But this is, of course, up to some discussion. So that would be maybe for now, and I'm sure I forgot still to address some of the things, but we will discuss it definitely.
Great. Thank you very much. Susanna, you were, I've seen that I've gotten a couple questions and I'll come back to those in a second, but the research of your institute, specifically on I think on this differential of the impact of general cohesion and structural funds that come to Central Europe versus the industrial policy, the more EU-wide industrial policy money that's now being developed. And Matt's referred to this as well. It has a differential impact for Central and Eastern Europe. And I was wondering if you could add anything further on that particular issue. And then I'd like to come to the questions, but go ahead first.
Yes, well, I mean, so when it comes to basically EU-wide industrial policy, there's two ways which we could look at it. One is this very nation-specific boost that countries get via recovery and resilience funds, other EU funds, and so on. And they're exactly as Michal mentioned. These are, net recipient countries which have benefited tremendously. Of course, there's also within that, we could discuss the suitability from an industrial policy perspective. So for example, in the case of Central Eastern European economies, what we generally find is that very tangible investments tend to dominate. So infrastructure, building new facilities, and so on. Intangibles, R&D and so on, is not so strongly supported. So if we want to move in the direction of more innovation-driven type of economic growth models, we also need to be thinking more on how to use the available EU funds into these types of activities. But then coming back to the sort of framework EU initiatives which are present, we basically see a very unlevel playing field, because these general EU schemes tend to be very much orientated towards just pushing the frontier more. So basically, it's very difficult for countries which are not so innovative to take part in them. And we see a very close correlation between GDP levels and participation rates in things such as Horizon, also important projects of common European interest and so on. The participation of Central Eastern Europe is very minimal, to say the least. In an encouraging step, we have been seeing these countries more and more support with their own policy space the participation. So, for example, providing some technical or financial assistance to companies which want to apply to these schemes and so on. But unless we somehow bring in more positive discrimination type of mechanisms, which would be more aligned towards cohesion policy, it does go in, unfortunately, the opposite direction of those EU funds, which are then distributed along a cohesion principle.
Thank you. I think this, Mats, this was a little bit one of the things that you were almost pointing to, the differential. Does EU industrial policy as such actually potentially lead to a widening of the gap between Central Europe rather than a more of an integration of it? If you want to come back on that or anything, and then I'll come to, I want to go to Mr. Strach's question first, because it was directly related to something that Susanna just said. But Mats?
No, good question, and I also think Susanna's remark was relevant here when it comes to some of these EU funds. I would perhaps say that it's more that there are transitions happening for different reasons, many different reasons, but including green and digital transitions, and the lack of joint funding that goes to all member states widens the gap. I'm not sure the funding as such widens the gap, but it does it because the people who get the money, for example, from this EU Innovation Fund that is funded by emission trading income, goes to not much to countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And that, I think, is a big problem in the negotiations on the new version of that, of the emission trading system as such. There was a compromise around, as one has done before, on regional balance and things, but that is very difficult to achieve as it's currently set up. So I think this is a very, very important topic, which can partly be handled through reform of this innovation and modernization fund and other instruments, front-loading the money to them and other things. But it's also quite important for the Central and Eastern European member state governments to facilitate even more than Susanna said. And I think, as I said before, that more funding for universities and institutes that are close to industry is very important. And also, I know we're coming to that question perhaps, but the administration of the national administration, the capacity of the national administrations is really, really important and weak in several CE states, I think.
Perfect. Well, so that actually leads, but your comments and those of Susanna actually lead to the two questions that have been posed. I'm going to reverse them in order because I think that it works better. Mr. Pavel Strach comment that he's making more of a comment to the discussants. He says that both the batteries and semiconductors are at the bottom of value chains, serving as foundational components for much more complex products. Therefore, no significant upward movement of economies in global value chains should be expected based on these two industries alone, which comes to me very much to Klara Vodovova's question. How do you assess the capacities of Central European public administrations to conduct industrial policy? Coming from Czechia, I have in mind the austerity policy currently promoted by the government, which may affect public sector capabilities, but also public investments into R&D, education, et cetera. And so one of the things that comes about, and it goes to actually a fundamental question about your paper, Michael. If governments are going for products that are actually at the lower end of the value chain, that are integrated into other products, is that smart industrial policy? And why did you choose those industries actually to focus on? Is there a problem with the capacity in public administrations to actually conduct industrial policy if they're not thinking, as Matt said in the beginning, forward, but rather just kind of looking for what they can do now?
Thank you for both these questions or comments and question. I think I would start by explaining why I actually selected these two areas of manufacturing and tied to Mr. Strach's question. So firstly, I would say that in both semiconductors and in batteries, there are different parts of value chain even within these manufacturing areas. So if we speak about production of batteries, we could very easily divide this process into at least 3 stages. And when we look at manufacturing of so-called battery cells, which is like a foundation then of the final battery, we see that even in Hungary, the largest company, well, 2 companies producing directly battery cells are actually able to capture the largest part of the value added from the overall value chain of battery manufacturing. We in Czechia, for example, we also produce batteries, but we produce only the final stage. We produce only the final packs of batteries, where there is really almost no value added compared to production of cells. Then we, of course, could discuss about processing of the raw materials, but it was not part of the paper. But you can achieve different level of value added across these. I think in batteries, really maybe the potential for new innovation and R&D spending within the countries where they manufacture is much lower compared to potential of some innovation and R&D that we see in the semiconductor industries. Again, even semiconductor production is differentiated across at least 3 different tasks that you deliver to actually produce the final chips. And we see that actually in history of Czechia, there are parts of the value chain which may seem very niche from the total number when we see the value of these niche areas. But let's say that we actually have very specialized knowledge and we have specialized research centers which can be actually tied to the new investments which will not only shape the production but also R&D in Czechia. So I would be a bit more optimistic in the production of semiconductors because I think it can be tied to many of these local centers which actually work on the topics of optoelectronics and other areas of production. And by the way, Czechia is, I think, globally the second largest exporter with specialized knowledge in microscopes for semiconductor inspection. So actually, there is quite some good knowledge. I think right after Japan, we are the second largest exporter of this very specialized niche area of production. But this is really like a very tiny part of the value which is to be found in this manufacturing sector. So I would be a bit more optimistic, but the truth is that on the example of battery industry, the potential is probably much lower, and there is much more focus on the strategic position to be able to produce these within the borders of the EU, which now takes the priority through the Net Zero Industry Act.
Did you want to say a quick word? And Susanna, maybe you too, just a quick word on the capacities issue. But then I'd like to pivot a little bit onto China. China both as a motivation for a lot of this industrial policy stuff, and China as a source of foreign investment into these areas, and whether or not there is a, quote, industrial policy that effectively is trying to push China into, as an investor into the EU to produce things in the EU. A little bit of Foxconnization sort of comments coming from China into Europe. But let's talk about the capacities issue. Do the governments actually have the capacity to direct this? Do the industry, and I'm going to add a little bit, how much can the private sector and captains of industry in these countries actually be integrated into the planning process?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, very relevant question for industrial policy. It's basically the main deterrent of why industrial policy should not be utilized as this government failure argument. So I think it's a very relevant point to raise. A few points on that. I mean, I think first one is that maybe in the Czech context, which was mentioned regarding the austerity measures and so on, I think what is first needed in many of these countries is convincing governments why industrial policy is needed in the first place. I think this is still a point where we haven't necessarily reached. In terms of then moving on to state capacity, once we have actually convinced these governments that some sort of industrial strategies can actually create structural change, which is very useful, then comes the point of, are these states capable enough to not fail? And I think there, well, firstly, we need to have monitoring mechanisms which would somehow help governments, even despite their institutional quality not being the level of, let's say, Western European standards. Because I think at the end of the day, it's very expensive to also maintain quality institutions. And this goes hand in hand and in tandem with economic development. So the expectation would be that as the economies develop, so would the institutions. But in the absence of this, how can we create sort of monitoring and mechanisms which would enable I would say some sort of evidence-based mechanisms. One part of that is, I think, to try to mitigate the brain drain, which we also see to the private sector. So how can we make public sector jobs more attractive and have much more people who are qualified in the area of, for example, innovation policy, industrial policy, working in state administration as well? So I think that would perhaps be the first step in what the governments could do in motivating more successful industrial policy.
Michael, before you come in, can I just say something that's a general comment? That question of monitoring and auditing, in fact, what government does, to me goes to the heart of democracy, which is freedom of expression and particularly freedom to criticize a government for when it makes a mistake. In the United States, we've had our little bouts with industrial policy previously. During the Obama administration, a little bit of investment in solar panels that actually did not go well. And it was good and important that the press was there to be able to say, you screwed up, government. And I think I think a lot of the Rethink CE fellowships are actually in this broader issue of governance and democratization and I guess my point is democratic values and industrial policy go hand in hand, and quite often they're not talked about together. And I just wanted to mention that. Mats, you wanted to come in as well on this question of administration, and then Michael, before we go to China, because I do think the China aspect of this needs to be addressed.
No, I just wanted briefly to agree with Susanna on the need, for example, to improve the conditions for people working in government administrations on these topics. But my ask for the floor was also because there is good research in Sweden, for example, other places, not on the question of administrations directing what should be done, what should be invested in, but on the facilitating part. I mean, it's really, really important that you have government, and also I think regional local administrations are quite crucial to facilitate permitting, of course, lack of corruption, but also to understand the technologies, the new technologies. What do they mean that you work together on this skills development, ability to catch up when it comes to housing for new investors. So I think that's a kind of sometimes underestimated thing in EU policy also, even if he doesn't have much competence on that. I think when now looking at milestones for next cohesion policy, this is really important, also linked to industrial policy.
Great, thank you very much. And I see we also have another question that's directly related to China that I will come to in one second. But Michael, did you want to say anything further on the capacities of state administration at this point?
Yeah, I think that both Susanna and Mats actually said the most important things. So maybe what I would only add on top of that is that even in the EU, I think around 2017, there were these discussions about setting up new productivity boards, new independent bodies to actually assess a lot of things happening in the States when it comes to innovation and spending on industries and regional development. And I think that only now in these years we see some first fruits, and even in Czechia we only see now new actually evaluation studies of what's been done in the past. So I think we are on the track, but I think that maybe this ex post analysis will now tell us and show us what we've done bad in the previous years, and we in that case should definitely be ready to scale up this capacity to be actually maybe slightly more prepared for the funds and for the state aid spending in the future.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Now, I'd like to go a little bit again, as I said, to the China issue, and the reason for that is that you know, you talk in your paper and you talked in your presentation about the importance of foreign investment in the Central European economies and in the structure of them, and how it drove many of the industrial policies in the past, and that foreign investment in the past was usually either large European firms or large OECD-based firms who were manufacturing and building manufacturing presence in Central Europe to serve the other manufacturers in the European economy. So exporting from Central European into Western Europe, primarily Germany. And a lot of that is, of course, in the auto industry, in all of the Central European economies, supplying parts and components into the internal combustion engine industry is a big part of it. We are now having a green transition that's pushing away from internal combustion engines with all of their very sophisticated engineering components into electric vehicles. And this gets very much into China. China started going to electric vehicles 10 years ago, as Mr. Gotch points out. China is a technology leader, particularly in the EV industry. And then they supplied their own market for a long time, and then 2 years ago they began exporting here. And they've been exporting at huge exponentially growth rates, which is going to affect the auto industry here, which is why there are these customs duties, among other things, being placed. And now the question is twofold. One is measures being used to make it more disadvantageous for China to export manufactured products to Europe, and is going to lead China to invest here and to some extent in Central Europe. But there's also the question about there will be a structural change in the Central European economies if, in fact, we move away from the internal combustion engine to something more simple in the electric vehicles. How does China's role in a bigger industrial transformation work, and is it being pushed by these measures on trade? And that I guess also goes to this question that Mr. Gogoch put in. The rationale of the Hungarian battery expansion is, if there is any, is mostly to provide a supplier base for electric vehicle manufacturing, and by that provide future perspective for the automotive sector, but a very small part of a segment of the auto sector.
Maybe if I can address this first. So first about measures and then the structural change. I would have a very brief comment at the beginning. Maybe what we now indicate for ourselves, our 2030, is set in the Net Zero Industry Act, that we would like to aim, according to also targets of European Battery Alliance, for approximately 90% of self-sufficiency in the demand for electric batteries within the EU, which is much higher than the average of 40% of Net Zero Industry Act. And we still, of course, keep the concept of open strategic autonomy. There is no discrimination, and I think everyone counts that a large share of this capacity will be actually delivered by Chinese companies and Chinese subsidiaries if we create the level playing field. And now we have a lot of new regulations in place, maybe not yet too, let's say, seen because it's very fresh, but we have new tools, and this anti-subsidy probe is one that targets the Chinese EV imports, but we also have foreign subsidy regulations for different public procurement. We have more mechanisms to actually create this and keep the rules-based trade and also investments in order. So I think that we slowly get this field actually set to welcome Chinese investments. And it's true, as also Bela Galgoci mentions, that there is this reverse technology transfer. In the past, it was very normal for us to go and do business in China under conditions of different joint ventures and technology transfer. Now this technology transfer starts to reverse. The question is how we will apply the tools which were applied previously, whether or not. But I think that definitely we need to actually welcome such investments to some extent. Hungary is really like a gateway now for Chinese investments in auto and battery industries, definitely. And from those measures, I think anti-subsidy now probe, which already has the preliminary results and very specific firm level new duties for specific brands, it can of course work, but what will happen and how the reality will be is of course hard to predict. But at least it tries to really still keep the rules-based trade under WTO, and these new duties simply just try to minimize these negative effects of illegal subsidies, but nothing else. On the structural change, I think we see in the CEE region that many of the auto producers, of course, do a lot to keep the employment, not to have that much of this social impact, but still there will be the impact. Maybe, and this is also well studied by other institutes and other NGOs, we see some maybe too optimistic messages coming from the car industry sometimes about how they will keep the employment levels. But maybe this can be sometimes too optimistic compared to some new data coming from different projects and the different transition projects, especially concerning the technology switch. So we will only see.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Susanna, do you want to jump in on this at all? Because I presume that this is an issue that you've been thinking about as well. And I think it also gets to one of the issues that you made in your original comments, because if there is a structural change in a major manufacturing industry in Central Europe, then one of the questions will be labor reallocation. What and labor training and things of that nature. And part of industrial policy really should be to help the workers who are there now move to other industries if a change is happening. And I see I've got another question, but we'll come back to that later.
All right. Yes. No, thank you for bringing me in. I mean, of course, China question is the very big one in industrial policy, also in the Central Eastern European context. Just to maybe add something to what Michal has already answered, I think with regards to the new tariffs, what we might actually see is this nature of tariff jumping. So as long as a new tariff is set, it might actually induce more foreign direct investment activity by China into the EU, Hungary possibly being the prime suspect of this. So we might actually see more and more production plans of Chinese companies being set in Central Eastern Europe to actually offset the negative implications of the tariffs. In terms of the structural change, yes. I mean, I think that's the nature of any type of industrial policy or any type of structural change per se, that there will be certain groups which will find themselves in relatively obsolete sectors. that should, of course, not deter the structural change to take place, but it needs to be supported by sound social policy measures, because otherwise what we'll find is a really uneven type of development. So I think, for example, in the Central Eastern European context, what is really underused is lifelong learning. So how can we still induce people who are already in the labor market to continue learning, to keep their skills, which are very much, up to date with the market needs. So I think this is one specific area which could be stepped up in this regard.
Thank you. And Mats, I want to come back to you, because we're now getting into this intersection of green and climate change, and the climate, well, green industries and green technologies as part of industrial transformation, and industrial policy is a tool to help do that. And I think Mr. Gogoch also comments that without China, the EU will never manage to reach its climate policy targets. A delicate balance needs to be found. The EU cannot follow US protectionism. A level playing field needs to be created, presumably with China. Affordability of low carbon tech is also an issue, e.g. for electric vehicles. EU auto industry goes high end, neglecting lower market segment, so controlled imports will be unavoidable. And one of the problems, Mats, that some people have with some of these changes being brought about by the green transition is that it does have a differential impact, including on people in Europe. I'm here in Belgium, where I am. The PTB is against e-vehicles because or against the duties on e-vehicles, because the people who are most affected are actually the poorer people. Thoughts on green transition, industrial policy, and how that links to Central European industry.
Well, I could speak for a very long time on that topic, but it's an important topic, of course. But I'll start by saying, as Susanna said, and I said in the beginning as well, and Michal emphasizes again this thing about structural change and the future, because there's often a comparison made to solar panels, where we are now importing so much of solar panels made in China for very low prices that, as was said in the comment here in the chat, also facilitates the green transitions, and German solar industry almost disappeared. But what is seldom said is that what also happened was that when integrating this solar and wind into electricity systems, which Germany was really the first country in the world to do in that extent, there was so much technology that has been developed in Europe for grid management, and now we see we have still very leading companies on power transmission issues, for example, around Europe. So one has to look at the broader picture than only the products. But then I would say that motor vehicles is a specific product group. It's so important, and there's so many European of the leading. I think the five companies in Europe that invest most in R&D are all car companies. So of course it's really important, and I would agree with the comment in the chat here also that one cannot stop Chinese electric vehicles, so to speak, generally. But what I think one can do on the electric vehicle side is first to I mean, if there are illegal subsidies, to have time limited tariffs, if one can prove this during that time, as the Commission is now trying to engage in a discussion with China about. But then also to promote the innovative European companies and not try to save every one of them, but to devise public procurement for the best ones from different performance criteria, or as the French do now, they give subsidies that are diversified according to the environmental footprint of the whole life cycle of an electric vehicle. So you can have that kind of tools, but it won't save all parts of European car industry. I think one has to look at these other measures as well. But then your question also brings up the much bigger issue about just transitions and different parts of Europe benefiting or perhaps losing from green transitions. But I would also say there that this is also quite market-driven and global, that European legislation is one factor, but there are many other factors, and I think this is it's really crucial to develop these supporting tools that we have been talking about on the EU level, including more money, better cohesion policy, and fairer use of innovation fund money, and many sorts of things. But I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Because I think we've got a couple more minutes, but it does bring us, I think, perfectly around, Michael, to what I thought that you were trying to study, and points that both Susanna and Mats made, which is how do Central European governments use an interest in industrial policy to actually position their economies and their workers for the future, not for just a task at hand. And I think that, and thinking broadly about how you integrate into that both state funds that come from the EU, and funds that come from the private sector, because in the end, private sector money should be a larger source of capital than public sector money. What I'd like to do just first is ask Susanna if she wants to make any last comments, then Mats, and then I'm going to go to you to wrap up, Michael, if that's okay. Susanna, do you have any final thoughts based on what we've just been talking about?
No, I think we managed to hit all the relevant issues in a relatively short time. So I am impressed, and it was very interesting to talk to you. Thank you.
Okay. Mats, would you like to add at this point, or but don't go off for hours on your special.
No, I just wanted also to thank for the discussion, but also to repeat that Michel's study is really, really good. I read a lot of these kind of studies in different parts of Europe. It's really good, and I really agree with the takeaways, and I would love to see more case studies. I mentioned digitalization and manufacturing in Romania. We have the Baltic states. We have sectors in Poland that are, I think, rather interesting, like construction, furniture, and other things that are not the high end always in description. So more of this. Thank you.
Michael, for you to make some final concluding remarks and additional takeaways that you have from this engagement that we've had today.
Yeah, no, thank you definitely once again to Susanna and Mats for all these inputs, and also to you, Peter, about all the questions which you posed. Maybe what I would like to highlight once again is that if we go back to the Central and Eastern European member states, but maybe also beyond, there were a couple of points that we mentioned today. So, of course, we speak about industrial policy, but we should also have the capacity to actually be able to come up with some strategies which have not only the objectives which may be aligned with what the EU as a whole expects, but also be able to come up with the underlying rationale why actually some of these policies could be or should be implemented. So maybe wrapping up, I would go back to some of the key takeaway points to highlight them once again, to actually mention that really in many areas, and this is really not only about batteries or semiconductors, but really different areas of manufacturing production, I think we can be pretty sure that in time we will have this level playing field across the EU, which is being formed and of course reacts very quickly on the fast development of last 5 years. I think we've never seen European Commission to come up with so many different packages and solution to those crises that we've been through. But actually on the national level, there we should be then quite strict about what we try to implement, because maybe in those areas as batteries and semiconductors, there is the target, but maybe there should be more capacity to really assess whether it makes sense to focus, for example, on semiconductors in Czechia. And that will definitely need much more of the capacity building. That will definitely need much more of this thinking about what are and whether there are actually market failures that the government should really tackle or not. maybe going back to this wider picture, one of these rationales behind all the new industrial policy is really purely based on the strategic dimension, on the way that maybe China used the argument of an infant industry before and was actually able to scale up a lot of capacity building and capabilities in those areas that we now have to somehow run to achieve and to also accept here in the EU, and the time is against us. So I think that there is a lot to discuss. I think we've covered some of the most interesting parts, but still, of course, if there would be maybe some new speaker next to us, maybe we would come up with another areas that the EU should tackle. And to me personally, I really look forward how now all these different topics that we discussed will be also complemented and built on by the new Draghi's report, how it will go back to the Let Us report on EU single market, how the competitiveness report of Draghi will prepare notes, so to say, for the new commission. But I'm sure that we will see much more of action in industrial policy with the new institutions. So I'm pretty sure that this can be considered like a beginning of discussion from the CE perspective, and I'm sure that we will, or I would definitely like to inspect it further with the new commission and beyond. So that would be from my side.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for doing the research, providing your thoughts, spending a lot of time on this. And I think in the end, really trying to encourage the Central European governments and people who were involved in this to be forward thinking in what they plan as they use public resources and encourage private resources to be used to build the economies. I also want to thank, of course, Mats Engström and Susanna Zavarskan for your comments and for your time. I'd like to thank my GMF colleagues, and particularly Susanna Veich, who has been behind here, and who, among other things, has once again posted a link to Matt's paper, which I encourage everyone to read. Not just read, but send comments to Matt's on, because papers like this should be the beginning, should be part of an iterative process as we try to help devise answers that will help our people and our economies adjust to major structural changes, which we are having now with the digital transformation and our response to climate change, and of course, the challenge of China's competitiveness. Thank everyone for attending, and take care. And if you can, apply for a fellowship, for a Rethink CE fellowship. Goodbye all.